Good evening, I'm Judy Woodruff. On the NewsHour tonight, a fourth guilty plea in the Mueller investigation as a clearer picture emerges of Russia's attempts to deceive Americans and sow divisions. Then Donald Trump Jr. kicks off a tour in India to sell luxury apartments. But a planned speech sparks questions over mixing business with politics. And while the debate over climate change plays out in the political sphere, a look at how science classrooms in Idaho are feeling the heat.
When a legislative body decides to recommend against science content, we undergo a great risk at denying our children really important information that they're going to need.
All that and more on tonight's PBS NewsHour. President Trump says he is calling for solutions to school shootings amid new demands for action on guns. He announced today that he is asking for regulations to ban devices like the bump stocks used in last October's Las Vegas massacre. The president spoke at an awards ceremony at the White House nearly a week after the school shooting in Parkland, Florida, that left 17 people dead.
We must move past cliches and tired debates and focus on evidence-based solutions and security measures that actually work and that make it easier for men and women of law enforcement to protect our children and to protect our safety.
Mr. Trump also said he will meet with survivors and local officials this week to discuss school safety. Meanwhile, some 100 Parkland High School students are making a 400-mile bus trip to the state capitol in Tallahassee. They will lobby lawmakers tomorrow for new gun laws. But today, the Florida State House voted not to consider a ban on assault rifles, as several Parkland survivors looked on. In the day's other news, Special Counsel Robert Mueller has obtained another guilty plea in his probe of Russian meddling in the 2016 election. Attorney Alex van der Zwaan appeared in federal court in Washington. He admitted to lying about contacts with former Trump campaign official Rick Gates. Gates was indicted last year on money laundering and other charges. Meanwhile, President Trump charged again that President Obama was not nearly tough enough on Russia. The long-running war in Syria flared on two fronts today, and the pace of killing escalated to levels not seen in 5 years. PJ Tobia has our report.
Rebel-held suburbs outside Damascus echoed today the sounds of government airstrikes and shelling, and would-be rescuers. Civil defense workers known as White Helmets raced to pull survivors to safety amid the assault. Towns across eastern Ghouta have come under intense bombardment by President Bashar al-Assad's forces for weeks. The attacks spiked Sunday. War monitors say 250 people have been killed since then. Hundreds more have been hurt. The government offensive drew condemnation today from the opposition's chief negotiator to the UN's stalled peace talks. He spoke in Brussels.
What's happening in Ghouta is a war crime. All international red lines have been crossed by the regime, but yet there is no accountability.
Meanwhile, a new northern front has opened in the country's 7-year civil war in the Kurdish region of Afrin. Turkey has been attacking U.S.-backed Kurdish fighters, known as the YPG. The Turks say they're linked to militant groups inside Turkey. Today, despite Turkish warnings, Syrian state TV showed pro-Assad forces rolling into Afrin to support the Kurds. But in Ankara, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan announced that Turkish guns had driven them off.
When artillery fire was carried out by Turkish military, they had to turn back, and this case is closed for now.
Erdogan also said he'd asked Russian President Vladimir Putin, an ally of Assad, to intervene. Instead, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said the situation can only be resolved through direct talks between Ankara and Damascus. American officials strongly oppose the Turkish offensive against the Kurds. The U.S. has been training and arming Kurdish militia fighters against the Islamic State group. U.S. troops are based about 70 miles east of Afrin, near Manbij, and the Turks have threatened to move in that direction. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson held intensive talks with Erdogan in Ankara last week in a bid to ease tensions. For the PBS NewsHour, I'm PJ Tobia.
In Iran, more than 300 Sufi Muslims have been arrested after overnight clashes that killed 5 police officers. Police said they were attacked as Sufis rallied in Tehran, demanding the release of detainees. Sufi officials denied it. The Sufis emphasize mystical experiences over traditional Muslim practices. They have been persecuted by Iran's Shiite regime. Back in this country, the Department of Health and Human Services proposes to let insurers sell limited health plans that do not comply with Obamacare's mandates. They would offer lower cost coverage with fewer benefits for up to 12 months, and companies could deny people with pre-existing conditions or charge them higher premiums. The proposal is open for public comment for 60 days. An outside legal review is now public on NPR's ouster last year of Michael Oreskes as its top news executive for alleged sexual harassment. It finds that there were questions about his behavior even before he was hired and repeatedly during his tenure. And separately, Tavis Smiley is suing PBS for breach of contract after it stopped distributing his show for alleged sexual misconduct. PBS says the suit is, quote, meritless. The chancellor of the Washington, D.C. public schools is stepping down under fire after a little more than a year on the job. The Washington Post had reported that Antoine Wilson bypassed a lottery system so that his daughter could transfer to a top high school. The D.C. schools are already embroiled in a scandal for allegedly inflating graduation rates. On Wall Street today, the market's winning streak snapped after Walmart reported weak online sales and subpar earnings. That sent the Dow Jones Industrial Average down 254 points to close at 24,964. The Nasdaq fell 5 points and the S&P 500 slipped 16. And at the Winter Olympics in South Korea, a big day for Canada. Ice dancers Tessa Virtue and Scott Moyer won their 3rd career gold medal with a record point total. American siblings Maya and Alex Shibutani took home the bronze. And the U.S. men's hockey team beat Slovakia 5-1 to get into the quarterfinals. Still to come on the NewsHour, the risks Russian bots pose in the U.S. today. Donald Trump Jr.'s trip to India under scrutiny for mixing business and politics. How and when climate change should be taught in schools, and much more. White House Press Secretary Sarah Sanders took questions from the press corps this afternoon for the first time in a week. She was asked about Russian election interference, school safety measures, and White House senior aide Jared Kushner's security clearance. On Russia, Sanders doubled down on the White House claim that President Trump has been tougher on Russia than his predecessors.
The president has been extremely tough on Russia. He helped push through $700 billion to rebuild our military. I can assure you Russia is not excited about that. He's helped export energy to Eastern Europe. I can assure you Russia is not excited about that. He has put and upheld sanctions that the Obama administration put in place. He's upheld those. He's closed 3 diplomatic properties that were Russia's here in the United States. He has taken number of actions against Russia and put pressure on them. He's helped arm the Ukrainians. There are a number of places that Obama was too weak and refused to take and put pressure on Russia where this president has.
So our White House correspondent, Yamiche Alcindor, has been tracking all of this, and she joins me now. So, Yamiche, we heard Sarah Sanders mention sanctions, said the president has upheld what was there under the previous administration, but there were also sanctions that Congress passed against Russia last year. Where do those stand?
Well, Sarah Sanders made the point today that there is still a process ongoing and that this White House needs time to impose those sanctions. But when I asked White House officials about them, they said that essentially they had already been compliant compliant with the law and that they're doing all that they were supposed to do. That comes as there's bipartisan frustration. Chuck Schumer and Peter King, a Republican and a Democrat, have put together and said that they want this president to impose these sanctions. And that comes, of course, as Sarah Sanders is making the point that President Trump always believed that Russia meddled in our elections, and that's just simply not true. The president has repeatedly questioned Russia's role in the elections.
So let's ask about, or let me ask you about the school shooting. The White House is saying today, this is what, how many months, 4 or 5 months after the slaughter of those people in Las Vegas with the guns using the so-called bump stocks, the White House is now saying that the president will go along with some sort of provision to ban bump stocks. Why the delay, and how does this affect the whole gun debate?
The delay is because the White House was trying to think through what it was going to do. But the White House is feeling pressured. In particular, the president is feeling pressured from all these mass shootings and these students speaking up. He, over the weekend, threw his support behind a bill that would force states to further really go through the background check system and actually be compliant with it. But then he's also taking unilateral steps with bump stocks. There had been a federal review of bump stocks that was going on since last year that had not been resolved. So what you see is a president who is trying to look like he's doing something, but these aren't huge changes. This isn't a federal ban on assault weapons. This isn't changing whether or not you can get an AR-15 at 17 or 19. So there's still a lot of things that he could be doing differently.
And I know we're continuing to watch that every day this week. Finally, and just quickly, Yamiche, the president's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, a lot of discussion about the fact that he still has only an interim security clearance. She was asked about that. How does that affect the work that he does in the White House?
It does not affect it at all. He has a top secret security clearance that's going to continue. President Trump can take that away from him, but there's no signs that he's going to do that.
Well, again, an issue that keeps coming up. Yamiche Alcindor, thank you.
Thanks.
Special Counsel Robert Mueller's recent indictment of 13 Russian individuals again confirms Russia's attempts to interfere in the 2016 U.S. election through the use of social media. But intelligence officials stress that Russia's attempts did not end back then. Today, U.S. Attorney General Jeff Sessions announced the creation of a cyber task force that will look into ways to fight this sort of activity by foreign governments and interests. To walk us through what we know about Moscow's interference and what we may expect in the coming months is Nina Jankowicz. She is a writer and analyst who focuses on Russian disinformation campaigns. She was recently a fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. Nina Jankowicz, welcome to the program. I want to just quickly read something from last week's indictment from the Mueller team. It states that the defendants, posing as U.S. persons and creating false U.S. personas, operated social media pages and groups designed to attract U.S. audiences, and they used stolen identities to post on organization-controlled social media accounts. So what exactly are they saying these Russians did?
Well, there's a lot of things that we're alleging the Internet Research Agency did. The main thing is that they posed as American citizens to amplify and spread content that is divisive in our society in order to, in some cases, pump up the Trump campaign, break down the Clinton campaign, or deflect the vote, suppress voter turnout, especially among minority groups, in order to create more chaos within our political system.
And how technically did they do that? How did they carry this out?
So Facebook calls these false amplifiers. They're not precisely bot accounts because bots are kind of computationally controlled accounts.
Remind us what bots are.
Right. A bot is, there can be millions of them at a time, usually hundreds of thousands of them. It's an account that may look like a real person, but often tweets or posts more frequently than a real person would tweet, and it's controlled by a computer program. What the Internet Research Agency or the Troll Factory did, these were accounts that really looked like American citizens. They behaved like American citizens, and in the indictment it even says one of the folks who was indicted wrote to a family member and said, you know, the Americans are buying this because they were so legitimate in the types of criticisms that people were levying point of politics at that time.
So pretty sophisticated stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. And long term, we saw that this was going on since 2014, and it was a widespread operation and pretty well funded. This is alleging over $1 million per month were spent on this operation.
So before these indictments came out last week, there was a testimony on the Hill by all the heads of every intelligence, major intelligence agency in this country. They all said to a person that these kinds of efforts by the Russians are continuing now, and there is concern that they're going to affect this year's midterm elections. What are they doing now? Are they doing the same things that the Mueller team identified? Have they changed their MO in any way?
Yeah, I think that they're doing the exact same things. This is a tactic that they have practiced over more than a decade in Central and Eastern Europe, in countries like Estonia and Ukraine, certainly, and then we saw it more recently in the UK and in Germany. And what they're doing is just amplifying divisive rhetoric, again, in order to create more chaos and distrust in the system. Ultimately, you know, a lot of people talk about hacking the election or hacking of voter rolls. We don't have any evidence of that happening yet. But what I'm most worried about going into the 2018 midterms is that suppression, voter turnout will be suppressed because people are going to be distrusting the system, distrusting that their vote matters. And that's the most dangerous thing and the most difficult thing to reverse.
And I saw a Wire story today that Italy is now another country that is concerned about Russian interference.
Yeah, absolutely.
In its elections. So, you know, we hear about what the Russians want to do is sow discord and division. What is their goal here, actually?
The goal is to discredit Western democracy as we know it, which then gives Russia a better seat at the bargaining table. I mean, 25 years ago, there was the Soviet Union and the United States, the two superpowers, right, in the world. In the intervening 25 years, we haven't talked a lot about Russia. And now, for the first time in those 25 years, Russia is on our lips every day. I mean, I'm sure there hasn't been a day that you haven't covered it here on this show. And that's exactly what Vladimir Putin wants, and it's exactly what Russia wants, return to a great power status.
So now we have to talk about how does this get thwarted? We know the White House was announcing this cyber task force today, but clearly much more has to be done.
Absolutely. This isn't only about cybersecurity. I often advocate for a whole of government approach, meaning not only do we need to make clear to Russia that this behavior is unacceptable and clear to other actors who might do it, because there are plenty of others drawing from Russia's playbook, but we also need to educate our citizenry. We need to talk about media literacy and civics so that people have an understanding of how our system works. Right now, we haven't updated our media literacy curriculum since the 1980s. And there are many, many groups that are doing great work in relation to this, but we need an investment in it on behalf of the government and certainly on behalf of social media companies as well, which have a near ubiquitous access to every American's life.
Which is another enormous set of questions out there about the role of these social media companies, whether it's Twitter, Facebook, and the rest of them. But in the short term, is there anything that individual Americans can do? What should they be on the lookout for, be careful about? Is there any sort of tools they can equip themselves with?
Well, there are a lot of great fact-checking sites online that I would encourage people to check out, but you can do these sorts of things in 30 seconds yourself. If something seems spurious or unlikely to you, do a quick search for a quote and see if it comes up anywhere else online. And just be very, very wary. You know, they're very clever about the types of impersonations they do. There was a Guardian site that was faked that used a Turkish I instead of an English I in its web address. Look for things like that. And then most of all, just talk to people of different backgrounds. Get into discussions, civil discussions. Break your filter bubble. That's the best thing that we can do to return to civil discourse and protect our democracy in this country.
A lot of common sense.
Absolutely.
Nina Jankowicz, thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
Donald Trump Jr. landed in India today to begin what will be a week-long trip across the country. Lisa Desjardins reports on some ethical questions raised by his visit.
Judy, the president's son, says this trip is strictly business. He says he's there to promote and sell condominium units at 4 different Trump-branded luxury properties, sales that the president would eventually profit from. But ethics experts say they're concerned that Donald Trump Jr. is also mixing business with state affairs. He is set to deliver a foreign policy speech, and its title at least indicates it's a foreign policy speech at the end of the week. That's an event that Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi is likely to attend. Shumeet Ganguly is a political science professor at Indiana University Bloomington. And I want to start, you just returned from India. Can you take us through the role of Trump business in India, where it fits, and then also the politics of a trip like this?
Right. To begin with, these are massive investments and extremely high-end investments in real estate. Some of the largest Indian developers of real estate are working with Trump in developing these properties in 4 major metropolitan areas, including in the town where I grew up in Calcutta, with a population of 14 million people. And there is now a segment of India's population with a very substantial disposable income, which likes glitzy, luxurious, high-end properties, which are also closed properties where they're sort of spared from the squalor of India, and they have these nice sequestered environments. And what better than to have the name of the President of the United States emblazoned across that property?
So these are high-profile, certainly very high-interest deals in India. Also raising eyebrows, though, in a way that I think is raising questions, are some ads that we saw, full-page ads this week in Indian newspapers, showing Donald Trump Jr. full page, and then this double entendre quote saying, "Trump is here. Are you invited?" Can you take us through the ethics here? They're selling condos, but they're also advertising access. Are they selling access? Is that how this would be interpreted in India?
They're not selling access directly, but it raises a question: if the president's name is on this property, if his son is hawking these properties and then giving a foreign policy address, it sort of commingles business and at the same time politics. And of course, the entire apparatus of the United States government that's present in India is going to be facilitating his visit. So it sort of raises questions about certain lines being blurred, that where does sort of a simple property development end, and where do the sort of the president's personal interests, particularly financial interests, become implicated?
Donald Trump Jr., though, is a private businessman. You know, he says we've already voluntarily said no new deals as long as my father is president. But should he be forced to limit himself because his name, which he makes his money off of, is also the president's name? If you follow me?
Yes, I certainly do. But the issue is not simply a matter that these deals were already underway. But the fact is that why, as a private citizen, is he giving a foreign policy speech where the Prime Minister of India may be present? And also, when one of the developers happens to be a critical member of the Bharatiya Janata Party, which is the party currently in power. It's blurring certain lines, which I think really should be kept quite separate.
The title of that address, as advertised by the summit organization, is Reshaping Indo-Pacific Ties. That's an active title, even muscular. We reached out to the Trump organization to try and get information about what Donald Trump Jr. would say. They did not get back to us. But something like that, is that usual for a businessman? And would Indians, you think, interpret what he says as representing U.S. policy?
They could certainly construe this as an endorsement of American policy or a statement of American policy, given that it's coming from the president's son, who, though he has no sort of formal role in government, has nevertheless been seen in sort of critical places in the White House. And consequently, again, we are talking about sort of failing to keep certain lines very, very clear, that one is a purely business enterprise and another is reflecting American foreign policy interests.
And the State Department has said that he is there as a private citizen. Shumeet Ganguly, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure entirely. Thank you.
Stay with us. Coming up on the NewsHour, harnessing the sun's energy in the Sahara Desert. U.S. victories and disappointments in the Olympic Games. Plus, a novel about an American dream and marriage torn apart by a wrongful imprisonment. The politically charged battle over climate change is increasingly spreading to the classroom. At issue, how and whether to teach it, including the scientific consensus about the role of human activity. It's a debate playing out in states adopting new science standards, including in Idaho, where a key vote could come this week. Special correspondent Lisa Stark of our partner Education Week reports from Boise. It's for our weekly segment, Making the Grade.
What's clay?
The Earth! These Boise second graders are playing an unusual game of tag.
On your marks, get set, go!
They're pretending to be sunlight. Once they reach Earth, they turn into heat. Some bounce back. Others are tagged and trapped by students masquerading as greenhouse gases.
Look at all my greenhouse gases. Look at that, all right.
The idea is to help students understand global warming.
Earth is actually warming up.
So the more greenhouse gases we add to the atmosphere, what happens to the temperature of the Earth?
Look.
Yes.
It gets hotter.
It gets hotter.
What is climate change? What did you learn about that when you were outside playing tag?
It's when people put more carbon dioxide in the air and it makes it warmer.
Boise State University professor Jennifer Pierce offers this lesson on climate change to elementary school classes.
I think it's my obligation as a scientist and as an educator and as a parent to teach our kids about how the greenhouse effect works, how humans and fossil fuels have contributed to the warming of our planet, and what we can do about it.
Pierce crafted these lessons after becoming alarmed when Idaho's Republican-dominated legislature moved to soften proposed state science standards to play down the role of humans in climate change.
Well, the legislators seem to think that, you need to present both sides of the issue, that you need to be even-handed.
There aren't two sides of the issue. The global warming is happening and humans are the cause. There's not another side of the issue.
We'd like to call the House Education Committee to order.
The fight over new Idaho science standards for grades kindergarten through 12 has now dragged on for 3 years.
You were on the committee that drafted these standards and redrafted these standards and redrafted these standards.
Yes.
What was the problem?
Melissa Farrow, an award-winning Idaho science teacher, believes lawmakers have tried to dismantle the group's hard work for political showmanship.
The big concern here is people think we're trying to sneak something by them. We're trying to indoctrinate the children of Idaho into concepts that go against the moral or religious beliefs of the citizens. But I would argue that the science is sound in these standards.
Last year, lawmakers temporarily approved the standards, but removed 5 sections on climate change, including one that emphasized, quote, the major role that human activities play in causing the rise in global temperatures. Lawmakers asked for a rewrite. Representative Ryan Kirby supported that, saying students were being force-fed one-sided arguments.
They just said, man has XYZ impact on the environment, or these things are bad, versus saying, hey, students, look at the data, do some research, and let's talk about the good things and the bad things that man do to the environment.
The public has overwhelmingly disagreed.
Science education shouldn't be a political issue.
Not some watered-down, censored version.
I ask that we not only keep the standards, but that we accept and appreciate all that they have to offer.
That did not sway the Idaho House Education Committee, which this month voted again, this time deleting one science standard that linked air pollution with fossil fuels and scrapping pages and pages of content that backed up every area of science instruction, including global warming.
The motion passes. Thank you.
Representative Scott Syme led the charge, saying he was deleting sections that didn't allow students to do their own scientific discovery.
When you have conclusions and standards, it stifles inquiry. What we're going to see is we're going to be developing scientists kids that can think on their own, that come to their own conclusions.
Syme refused repeated requests for an interview, but told a newspaper, quote, "I don't care if students come up with a conclusion that the Earth is flat, as long as it's their conclusion, not something that's told to them." The debate over teaching climate change is hardly limited to Idaho. There have been a number of states as they have been revising their science standards where this has become a hot-button issue. New Mexico's attempt last fall to weaken climate change instruction generated protests and fierce backlash.
The children, the future of New Mexico, deserve better.
Ultimately, the State Department of Education backed down. Recent attempts in at least 9 states to block, repeal, or modify state science standards, partly because of the treatment of climate change, have largely failed. All this comes during a government administration skeptical about global warming.
The United States will withdraw from the Paris Climate Accord.
In the case of climate change, of course, there have been many really concerted efforts to kind of deny the science.
David Evans is the executive director of the National Science Teachers Association.
When a legislative body decides to recommend against science content that's been well vetted by the science community and the education community, we undergo a great risk at denying our children really important information that they're going to need.
Each of these has a type of resource on it. See if you can decide whether it's renewable or non-renewable.
The Boise School District isn't waiting for the state to act. There's local control of education in Idaho, and this district is teaching climate science.
I know that global warming, even if it's not caused by humans, it's at least happening with our Earth is warming up slowly.
I don't genuinely think of, oh yeah, climate change and global warming, yeah, I could change that, I could do that. I feel like that's something that everyone would have to come to, not just one person.
Science teacher Nathan Dean says in more rural, conservative parts of Idaho, global warming will only be taught if it's required by the state.
I feel like we'd be really remiss to say that we're preparing kids in science education and science literacy if they aren't aware of global warming and climate change and the science behind that.
Dean bristles at what's been happening in the state legislature.
I think that it would be kind of educational malpractice to pretend that there's two sides to that scientific argument.
Representative Kirby says he's not opposed to teaching global warming, as long as kids figure out the causes based on their own research.
We really want the students to protect our environment, to protect our planet. But we want them thinking, not being spoon-fed.
I'm making a tractor that has a solar panel on it.
Back in that second grade Boise classroom, students are figuring out ways to help protect the environment.
If you want to go to the zoo, you don't need to drive. You could bike there. It's basically a cooling vest. So whenever it's too hot, you can put on the cooling vest. It'd be
So far, though, there's no indication anyone is cooling off in Idaho. It's now up to the Senate Education Committee to decide whether to go along with their House colleagues or leave the science standards intact. The vote is expected as early as this week. For the PBS NewsHour and Education Week, I'm Lisa Stark in Boise, Idaho.
Next, we turn to Morocco, home to the largest solar energy plant in the world. Today, the planet Earth meets over 80% of its energy needs with either coal, oil, or gas. But as climate science and breakthrough technology disrupt the energy sector, Morocco is taking advantage of an abundant natural resource, unobstructed sunlight, to power part of the North African nation. Special correspondent Monica Villamizar looks at a giant $9 billion project. It's part of our ongoing series, Peril and Promise on the Challenge of Climate Change.
Glimmering in the Sahara Desert, a first-of-its-kind solar energy plant. Nur, which means light in Arabic, is so vast it can be seen from space. From the air, it's an ocean of reflective mirrors. But on the ground, as we drive into Noor, sunglasses are mandatory protection from the blinding rays.
I like it. It's a great project, great opportunity.
28-year-old Mustafa Ibaritan is part of the team of local engineers working for the project. Noor is owned by the state of Morocco and built by Spanish company Sener. The project is based in Ouarzazate, a tiny tourist town at the edge of the desert.
In Morocco, we don't have petrol, we don't have gas. To be independent, to have our own energy, we have chosen to use the clean energy because of the climate change challenge.
Morocco does have sunlight, about 3,000 hours of sun every year. And harnessing that light is an evolutionary leap for the country.
Right now, it's the most popular solar plant in the world. I'm proud to be part of this project.
Noor uses CSP, or concentrated solar power. Concave mirrors direct the sun to a middle tube to heat an oil solution. The mirrors rotate as the sun moves, like sunflowers. The heated fluid, which reaches 750 degrees Fahrenheit, produces steam to power a turbine. The King of Morocco is making a huge bet on clean energy, and the goal is that renewables will power half of the country by 2040. Within this strategy, Noor, the solar plant, is the flagship project. The North African nation says it wants to be the Saudi Arabia of solar energy, tapping its vast solar reserve. Morocco's king inaugurated Noor and flipped the plant's on switch in February 2016.
This was a huge, brave decision at the time when they took it. 2009-10, everybody was laughing. It was very expensive. It was a very brave decision.
Back in 2003, the think tank Club of Rome came up with an ambitious project called Desertec. The idea: harness solar energy across the Sahara to power all of Europe.
Desertec set the guidelines on how to produce renewable energy in the desert to supply electricity to Europe.
Francesco Steppo is president emeritus of the Club of Rome in the US.
Now other organizations are implementing the Desertec concept.
Steppo says the Noor plant in Morocco and another plant under development in Tunisia are pilots of the Desertec idea. The plan originally had ambitions to open solar energy farms across the Sahara, but the Arab Spring uprisings of 2011 and terrorist attacks on gas facilities in Algeria forced them to scale back.
Geopolitical instability is always the main obstacle for the implementation of these kind of projects.
Renewable energy continues to be the fastest growing segment of the energy space.
Sarah Ladislaw is a senior fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. She says there's economic risk to any new large infrastructure technology.
Downside with any project that is groundbreaking is that you're going to experience cost or logistical or technological or market-based hurdles that you might not have expected. The upside is that once you've done it, then we know more about the cost and the ability for those costs to decline over a period of time.
CSP's critics say it isn't cost-effective. Noor's price tag was $9 billion. Long-term, it could recover the investment if the technology doesn't become outdated too quickly. Before the government of Morocco started building the Noor plant in the town of Ouarzazate, the area was best known as a tourist stop with breathtaking sights and its own miniature version of Hollywood. Game of Thrones, Gladiator, and Lawrence of Arabia were all filmed here.
He's looking at you, kid.
The classic Casablanca actually hinted at why concentrated solar power technology is a challenge to implement in Morocco. It requires vast amounts of water.
I came to Casablanca for the waters. The waters? What waters? We're in the desert. I was misinformed.
Engineer Mohsin Ait Ali showed us this man-made lake that was built just so Noor could operate. He said the reservoir addresses the plant's water demands.
The solar complex uses about 6 million cubic feet of water each year, and that's about 1% of the storage capacity of the lake.
It distributes the water to all the plant on site.
The engineers are most excited to talk about the next phase, still under construction, Noor 3.
So this is the tower. After the construction, it will be the highest building in Africa with 246 meters.
The tower looms over North 3. It will incorporate a newer technology where flat mirrors bounce the sun's rays to the tip of the tower.
So here in North 3 we have around 7,000 mirrors.
The solar energy is stored in molten salt, which means the plant can keep making electricity for 7 hours after sunset. When it's finished later this year, Noor will provide electricity to over 2 million people. It has generated high expectations for Morocco and the future of solar power. For the PBS NewsHour, I'm Monica Villamizar in Ouarzazate, Morocco.
The past few days have been rougher for the American team at the Winter Games in Pyeongchang. Some of the bigger names heading into these Olympics have not won as many medals as hoped. But as William Brangham checks in with an update from South Korea, the Olympics are still providing their share of memorable moments in skill, drama, and grace.
I spoke earlier with Christine Brennan of USA Today, who's also a sports commentator for CNN. She's in Pyeongchang, and I began by asking about some of the standout performances in figure skating over the last week, including the ice dance competition last night.
When you think of figure skating, of course, it's always one of the most dramatic locations for any Winter Olympic Games, and this one has been no different. Certainly ice dance had all kinds of thrills and chills and falls and spills. The Canadians, Tessa Virtue and Scott Moore, actually won their 5th Olympic medal, and that is the most Olympic medals ever won in figure skating. They've had team competition, they've had individual, the ice dance as well. And they go all the way back to Vancouver, winning the gold in 2010 in their home country, and now they came back again. A terrific story of staying together in a sport that often is split up, where people fire coaches and change partners, and these two have been together since they were little kids. And so a great victory for Canada. The U.S., the bronze for the Shibutani, the Shib-Sibs as we know them, Alex and Maya Shibutani, which was a great result for them and their perseverance. But the other two U.S. ice dancers both fell, and you really rarely see falling in ice dance. And it just, like, you almost can't believe that this is happening in ice dance, especially with the country that is the deepest and strongest in ice dance, which is the United States.
All right, let's talk about tonight. It's a big night for the women's figure skating.
Yes, you know, women's figure skating really is the crown jewel of the Olympic Games. Don't expect a U.S. medal. The three Americans, potentially Mirai Nagasu with that triple axel, that historic triple axel in the team competition, she's in the conversation for the bronze medal. But this is looking like Russia at the top. Russians have not won an individual medal yet at these games in figure skating, which they usually own. They had a team silver medal, but otherwise no individual medals in the other 3 events so far. It is going to be, I think, some young names and young faces, especially with the Russians. 15-year-old Zagitova, 18-year-old Medvedeva. They're really the class of the field at this point. So don't expect a U.S. medal, and I think that's kind of the story of these games in many ways, not just in figure skating, about the U.S. performance here.
In fact, speaking of that, there have been a number of competitions where the U.S. has come up short. What do you think is going on there? Is this just a function of these other countries just being a lot stronger than we anticipated?
I know the U.S. Olympic Committee would love to have the answer to that question, although there have been Olympics in the past where the U.S. has not done well at all. You have to go back in the history books. It's kind of interesting because in 1968, the U.S. won 1 gold medal at those games in Grenoble, France. One of the most amazing gold medals the U.S. has ever won. Peggy Fleming, of course, with her figure skating gold in '68, 50 years ago. And even going back to Lake Placid, a home Olympics in 1980 for the United States, only 6 gold medals, 5 of them by Eric Heiden in his tremendous speed skating performance, and then the most famous Olympic gold medal of all for the United States in the Winter Games, and of course that's the Miracle on Ice in 1980. So there certainly have been other Olympics where the U.S. has not just had this incredible medal haul. But then going back to Vancouver just a few years ago, well over 30 medals. This one is different. You're seeing some athletes who are well known, people like Lindsey Vonn, people like Michaela Schifrin, not having the performances that we expected throughout the games, although Schifrin does have a gold, and Lindsey Vonn is going for a big one in the downhill. But I think that's part of the problem. I also think it's just the reality of the winter sports scene and the world, and that is the United States is good, but often not great. And that's certainly not satisfying to a lot of Americans who are used to winning, sports fans who want to only see victories. But I also think there's something enticing about seeing it in this platform, seeing the world come together, the greatest and largest peacetime gathering, regularly scheduled gathering of the world. And I think that can be something in and of itself, that you don't have to say, okay, hey, the U.S. is not going to win if the U.S. isn't winning gold, silver, or bronze, I don't want to watch. I don't know that Americans feel that way.
And as we speak, Norway is leading every other country when it comes to medals.
Well, Norway is having the games of its life. And I harken back all the way back to 1994 in the Lillehammer Olympics. And Norway put on such a push there to have a great games. And of course it's ski jumping and it's of course all the cross country skiing and so many other things that they're just so good at. And they were great then, and they had this incredible push. And then they had a little bit of a dip, and I think you can see now how much that they put the nation's effort back into winning. And this is no surprise. Canada had a great games in Vancouver. Russia had a great games in Sochi just 4 years ago, although we found out about the massive state-sponsored doping there that certainly changes our picture and our image of what those games were for Russia. And so Norway, the fact that it kind of ebbs and flows and now they're back again, it's terrific to see. And the exuberance of the Norwegians here, you run into them and they are just so proud and so happy, and it makes you just smile.
Finally, there have been 3 different allegations of doping in the current Olympics. One, most notably against a Russian curler who, because of that nation's prior doping scandal, was having to compete under a neutral flag.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's almost hard to believe that Russia, known as OAR here, Olympic athletes from Russia, that here we are, there's allegations of doping, and lo and behold, it's an Olympic athlete from Russia, in curling no less. I mean, you almost can't make this stuff up. They're on basically double secret probation here. They barely got into the Olympic Games. It's individual athletes, of course, as many know, of course, no flag, no Russian flag, no Russian anthem. And then that the doping allegation we hear about is a Russian athlete. It's just incredible. There's been a lot of talk, and the International Olympic Committee actually did say that they might allow the Russian flag into the closing ceremony. The idea being Russia behaved, Russia played by the IOC's rules, and so now as a reward, you'll get to have your flag come into the closing ceremony. And I think there's a great doubt now about whether Russia will be allowed, OAR will be allowed to have their flag, because the IOC almost frankly cannot do that after these allegations.
All right, Christine Brennan of USA Today, thank you very much.
Thanks very much.
Now, Jeffrey Brown discovers the next item on the NewsHour bookshelf. Author Tayari Jones talks about her latest work.
Two people come together, get married, and then see their lives torn apart when the husband is falsely accused and convicted of a crime. A new novel explores the bonds of love and marriage in extreme circumstances against a larger background of race and mass incarceration. It's called An American Marriage. Author Tayari Jones joins me now. Welcome to you.
Thank you.
Is it correct that this began for you with thinking about the issue of mass incarceration?
It did. I was on fellowship at the Radcliffe Institute at Harvard, and I was doing research on mass incarceration. And I did so much research. I learned so many disturbing things. But, you know, I'm not an ethnographer. I'm not a sociologist. I'm a novelist.
Yeah.
And I had nothing to show for my time. The deadline was ticking for the presentation, and I had not written one fictional word.
Yeah.
But I went to Atlanta to visit my mother, and we went to the mall. And while I was at the mall, I overheard a couple arguing. And I heard the woman say, "Roy, you know you would not have waited on me for 7 years." And with that, my imagination just went wild with imagining the conflict between these two people.
Yeah. So you created your fictional Roy, who's the character, and Celestial, his wife. He gets sent off to prison, and then it becomes what happens, right? How do people behave under stress? What do two people owe each other?
Yes, how do you balance your desires and your responsibilities? I mean, Celestial, she's about 25 when he's arrested, and they've only been married 18 months. Her daddy is still paying for the wedding when he is taken away. Can we really expect her to basically live her life for him? how could you ask that of her? But then there's a feeling like, how could she not? And that, I think, is the conflict of the story.
You wrote this with alternating voices through letters that they sent to each other, but this was to give the two voices of a marriage? What?
The letters for sure, because I'm a letter writer in real life.
Yeah.
I write 5 or 6 letters a week.
Actual letters?
Yes, and nobody writes me back. It's terrible. But I love the idea of them being with him in prison. The letters, just this literal small canvas, is all they have to try to be husband and wife with. You can just see how it's a losing battle. But I did want both their voices because with him being in prison and her being in the world, they inhabit 2 different worlds. Neither of them is able to tell the full story.
There's a heartbreaking moment in the exchange of letters where the stress of imprisonment is so profound. And he writes to her, one sentence, "Dear Celestial, I am innocent." And she writes back and says, "Dear Roy, I am innocent too."
Yes, because it's true. She is innocent. His innocence feels more elevated because he has been jailed for a crime he didn't commit. But she also, as his wife, is being jailed for a crime she didn't commit either. And they really have to figure out, will they remain married while he's in prison? And if they do, what does that mean to be married to someone you cannot touch?
Race is a constant here, along with incarceration, but also the questioning of growing up in a kind of well-to-do Black Atlanta. And I read that this is your own upbringing. What were you trying to bring out?
Well, I do think that modern Southern life for Black people is really underrepresented, right?
Yeah.
People think of the South as shorthand for Black misery.
Yeah.
But, you know, I grew up in Atlanta where there's this really robust Black middle class where I needed a doctor, and my godmother was reluctant to send me to the doctor because the doctor had not gone to Morehouse College. The doctor had gone to Harvard. But she says, but I think he'll be okay for your cold. So Atlanta, for me, is that kind of place where it's kind of a Black oasis. But and Celestial and Roy, I think, forget about the circumstances in the rest of the world, the rest of the country. And they go visit his family in the small town where he's from, and he is, as Celestial Father says, the wrong race at the wrong time.
But you clearly wanted to put the African Americans sort of at the front of the story.
Yes, I mean, that is really the question of progress. What does it mean to be an individual? What is your responsibility to the collective? How is this amplified by race? Is it fair? Is fair beside the point? So these are the kind of hard, I think, very modern questions. I think it's a very modern moment for a Black character to have to wonder whether or not the problems of one are the problems of all.
And I have to ask you, the title, An American Marriage, that's a big title, right? I mean, that puts, sort of ups the stakes.
I was reluctant to take it for 2 reasons. For one, I had never really thought of myself as American without saying Black American or African American. I told my editor that I felt like An American Marriage sounded like a novel about white people in Connecticut. And he says, Connecticut is a very small state. Why would you think what happens in that small state was somehow more representative of America than what happens in Atlanta, one of the largest cities in the country? And so I had to really think it over. And then he asked me another question. He says, if you feel that this title does not represent your work, I will support you in changing it. But if you're afraid of stepping into the world of big ideas, if you're afraid that your novel cannot support the weight of the claim of an American story, he says, I really implore you to rethink it. And I said to him, I'll tell you tomorrow. And then I just thought about it, and I just decided to be brave.
You did, and you stepped into big ideas.
Yes.
Okay, the title is An American Marriage. Tayari Jones, thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
And that is the NewsHour for tonight. I'm Judy Woodruff. Join us online and again here tomorrow evening. For all of us at the PBS NewsHour, thank you, and we'll see you soon.
You're watching PBS.